Welcome to Going Underground with me, Afshin Ratansi. 3 times a week, we're bringing you the stories that really matter in the United Kingdom, ones you won't find covered by the mainstream media. In today's show, protest? What protest? How the British media seem to miss what happened on London's streets on the 5th of November. Plus, policing the police, is there really such a thing as reasonable force when it comes to dealing with protesters? And as it's Remembrance Sunday tomorrow, we look at the red poppy versus white poppy debate. For these stories and more, let's go underground. If you weren't at the Million Mask March on the 5th of November, you might not even know it happened. Associated with the hacktivist movement Anonymous, millions of people in nearly 500 cities worldwide, including thousands of people across the UK, took part in demonstrations against cuts, corruption and state surveillance. Union members and many others also marched in protest at austerity measures. But the corporate media in the UK didn't think any of this warranted much coverage. Even the arrest of 15 people involved in clashes with the police near Buckingham Palace didn't seem to merit a headline on news channels. With me is RT's very own Sarah Firth. Welcome to Going Underground, Sarah. No other media thought it should merit a headline. Why did you think it was an important story?
Afshin, call me old-fashioned, but when there are thousands of people marching to the Houses of Parliament right outside the front, people then marching on Buckingham Palace with some very vocal points that they wanted to make. I think that, as a reporter, that's exactly what you should be doing. It's a story that you've got to cover. And actually, it can't be ignored. You know, you've got social media putting it out there, so traditional forms of media really have to keep up, and that's why we were there covering it every step of the way. Did
it surprise you it wasn't on the main broadcasters, the state-mandated BBC or ITV? There was no headline about it. It's not a D-notice. You don't think there's some conspiracy, or they just weren't interested in fireworks at Buckingham Palace?
I think it's really difficult because the fact that there was no media coverage as this was going on does, of course, fuel those, conspiracy theories that this media blackout's all pre-planned. But I think it's unfortunate that the mainstream media is really getting a reputation for ignoring events of this kind. This isn't the first time that they've done it. A lot of the people who were turning out to join in this march were expecting it, and I think it's really, really sad that, unfortunately, many of the media outlets did live up to that expectation and just weren't there. Very surprising, I think, for me being there with our RT cameramen. I mean, it was just this amazing picture, these, amazing messages. It was such a big
I saw them tweeting. People were tweeting at you.
Yeah. Everyone was getting very engaged in it, and it was, a very fast-developing story, as you saw from the pictures. A lot was changing. They moved from Trafalgar Square, they moved on to Parliament Square, and then, of course, we had that unexpected twist where they took to the streets of London and went to Buckingham Palace. They took this fight to the steps, to the doorsteps of our government leaders.
The press did, in fairness, start to cover it many hours later. I don't know whether some of your footage ended up on some mainstream broadcasters because they didn't have anyone there. But they centred on Russell Brand, on a celebrity being there, rather than the issues of why these people were protesting.
Yeah, and I think, you know what, that shows, I think, a real snobbery, that when a story's happening, you make that editorial decision about what's important, what's not important. This is a news event. When thousands of people turn out onto the streets in that sort of protest movement, you've got to report it. I mean, you can't ignore that happening. And so, yeah, I think it's really surprising, very disappointing that it wasn't covered and didn't get the coverage it deserved.
And these actions took place in nearly 500 cities around the world. Corporate media in America was covering the DC and LA protests. Do you think it's odd that the Guy Fawkes mask from V for Vendetta, it's all about the British Parliament and Britain?
Yeah, I mean, that's what's so crazy, because, of course, the Anonymous Masters is taking place around the world, and this is, a British tradition. I don't
Parliament?
I don't think around the world people know who Guy Fawkes is, do they, really? That's become the Anonymous emblem, but, that was our tradition, and so you'd have thought that we would be at the very centre of that coverage, saying, it's bonfire night, and Guy Fawkes is still a symbol of political mischief. It's now gone global. And, yeah, that just didn't happen.
There were many, many police vans all over Parliament Square, up by the Mall. What did you think of the police tactics used on the demonstration?
it was strange the way that it was handled, I think, for me, watching the way that it developed. I definitely got the sense that the police maybe weren't prepared for the march onto Buckingham Palace. They
hadn't seen the film.
They hadn't. No.
They wouldn't have been prepared for the blowing up of Parliament
Well,
then if
no,
they didn't think
wouldn't.
they'd go to the Queen.
But you make a very serious point. I mean, as things had developed, it could have taken a turn for the worse. And I think what we saw was a slightly chaotic, heavy-handed approach, rather than what could have been a much more organised, moderate approach. So there were, a lot of police around, a very heavy police presence. But on Parliament Square, we saw things developing very quickly. And then you sort of have the police jumping in, and there's a lot of pushing and shoving. The tension, changes in a second. Everyone gets very hot under the collar.
The police are suffering cuts themselves. You think they'd identify with the anonymous
protesters were saying that to them. The protesters were saying to them, you're suffering as much as us. But the sort of engagement, the way they engaged with protesters, unnecessary tensions were created, I think, and we saw that. We were with the protesters. But we did get a little bit too up close and personal with the Metropolitan Police at moments of it. That's because it does sort of change very quickly, the mood amongst the protesters, when the police are seen to be acting in a heavy-handed way. But when you're shoving the protesters in that manner, of course, it is going to just flare tempers, and that's definitely what we saw. As we saw from the footage. Yeah, I mean, my cameraman was absolutely amazing, that she was sort of being dragged left, right and centre, and we were sort of trying to film a piece to camera as people were being shoved. At one point, I got someone get me by the back of the collar and drag me off, obviously not realising I was press. RT's Sarah Firth, thank you for coming on Going Underground. Thank you for having me, Ashin. The current law here in the UK states that police are allowed to use reasonable force when it's necessary. But what does that actually mean in practice? 4 police officers currently face prosecution after a mentally ill prisoner, Thomas Orchard, died in custody when officers tied a restraining belt across his mouth. In fact, over 800 people have died during or following encounters with the police since 2004. All cases are investigated by the Independent Police Complaints Commission. Not one officer has so far been convicted. With me is Charlie Veach of the Love Police. Charlie, welcome to Going Underground. You're in trouble with the police, or at least you have been. What is reasonable force? Because it's been applied to you. Only reasonable force.
Well, reasonable force is a very open and vague concept which the police can use to prevent themselves being sued either through a criminal or a civil case. So when they get an activist, for example, a guy called Archie during the student riots, he very violently headbutted the police truncheon about 5 times, and because it was his head attacking the police truncheon, which gave him a kind of concussion. And
damaging taxpayers' money, property.
Yeah, so basically the police, by holding their truncheon peacefully and him headbutting it, they used reasonable force there.
They sent him away for a while?
He had to go for brain surgery that very night to save his life because he had bleeding on the brain. So it's reasonable.
How did you see the media coverage of that at the time? Because that's certainly the first time one saw that case. The right-wing press were pretty quick, I would assume, to say, well, yeah, the police are right.
As we saw with the London and Manchester riots, the one after the Mark Duggan shooting, and also the student riots, the establishment press, Daily Telegraph, Daily Mail, Daily Express, the BBC, obviously conveyed a picture that these were drunken, stupid, criminal yobbos wanting to cause wanton, nihilistic destruction.
But the corporate media quick to paint that case and other cases as the police trying their best to control the mob.
Well, what happens, Ashin, those with a monopoly on violence and on force, as in the state, the military, the police, will always denounce the small peasant who thinks that maybe I can also use force, or I can show my displeasure by attacking a police van or a government building, as we saw during the student riots. And so you need a perspective that is outside the establishment to sometimes tell the truth about what's happening. Because when we, the West, not we, but the West will support these hyper-Islamist terrorists in Syria attacking the government, and they're freedom fighters and rebels. But when you get many levels of less intensity of a student who is very upset that his Lib Dem leader, Nick Clegg, said no tuition fees, and all of a sudden he has to pay £9,000 per year £30,000 over a degree, and he goes and smashes up a bus stop, which isn't like bombing a Syrian government building, but they get painted as the most nasty, low-life. There's a whiff of eugenics about the kind of press saying that the poor are responsible for their own poverty. It's a very clever way to kind of keep the establishment established and keep smashing down the poor.
But what about this police viciousness? I mean, I think I remember Jean Genet talking about the '68 Vietnam demos and saying there's something curious here because the police ranks are from the poor and they're the ones beating these people up.
Some very clever Roman, who I can't remember his name, said you can always pay half the poor to kill the other half because they want money. There's the unenlightened poor. Police viciousness, one of my big issues that I've been telling many people like
You've
yourself.
been hit, personally.
I've been hit personally. I've been truncheoned.
And handcuffed pretty badly.
Handcuffed
and all
very
that.
tightly. The police, God bless their little angry souls, have to deal with drug addicts and junkies and rapists and murderers. So then those people are dirty, but when they go to a protest, when there's a bunch of, dreadlocked, clean, middle-class kids with a social conscience, they can release all their anger and hatred and start smashing up these people who their only crime is for speaking out against what they see as wrong.
And so, and that's being used very effectively in the times of austerity, presumably. And we'll see more of that?
Well, we saw it in the 80s, didn't we, with the miners and how the police, quite happily, they might be in the same boat, they might come from the same kind of socioeconomic background, but they'll happily smash up because the police are very well indoctrinated. They wear the big Queen's crown, they have to swear allegiance, they have to swear an oath to the Queen. So their job is to earn their £30,000 a year and a fantastic pension to maintain order and to uphold the Queen. They're paid to not think. Their salary depends on them not being able to see the bigger picture.
Albeit that we have seen plebgate and some kind of rumblings against the government.
Yeah.
And the Tories, I don't think Cameron's people are that fond of the Metropolitan Police at the moment.
Again,
or is it you're saying they just protect the Queen and Prince Charles?
Well, there's the establishment, which might contain the Conservatives and the Labour, but then there's the permanent establishment, which is very old money, the Windsors, the Duke of Lancaster, the Duke of Westminster, the Dukes, the ladies. That's the real establishment which the police work for. They don't swear allegiance to the government of the day, they swear allegiance to the Queen.
How do you see regulation working when we hear of more cases of Mark Duggan and others?
Well, anyone who's come up against paperwork
Not that we're
regulation-
prejudging the Mark Duggan one, that's ongoing.
Oh yeah,
the one that
we can't
precipitated
comment
the riots.
because it's an ongoing thing, of course. But the IPCC is made up mostly of ex-policemen, and we all know that institutionalization can get people into a culture. The word cult comes from culture. There is a police culture, and they'll always look after their own. And when you've been indoctrinated in the system for 25 years as a policeman, and then suddenly you're meant to snitch and rat on your fellow cops, you're not going to do that good a job. They will twist it as much as they will go within the book of the law to kind of say that everything's
Well, you say we all know, but the Supreme Court presumably sees through that, thinks it's okay. The Attorney General, whole levels of parts of British government would say they don't know that, and the IPCC, is a good institution.
I'm glad you raised that. I think people in Britain get very distracted by the infighting at the kind of middle echelons of political power. Labour versus Conservative, the courts, changing this ruling, or appeals here, the police complaints. Whereas in fact, you can tell who's in charge by who you're not allowed to criticize. I want to see some mainstream outlets criticizing the Queen, criticizing Prince Philip, criticizing the Nazi connections in the past, and criticizing the fact that we send young...
I'll never get my knighthood now.
No, I know, sorry.
Anyway,
and we send... My favourite
Nazi
irony...
connections in the past.
That's in the
That's
past.
like the Daily Mail thing. You're being as bad as the Mail was to Miliband.
Exactly. Like I wear a Hugo Boss watch. Who cares that he designed the SS uniform?
I mean, much more seriously, deaths in custody, these statistics, no prosecution of one police officer.
Within the rule of law, when they do an inquiry into a death in custody, there's always footage of some terrified prisoner who's innocent until proven guilty. So he's still an innocent man. It's mostly men that get killed. And he might be kicking off, understandably, because he's been held in captivity and he's an innocent man. And so for kicking off and complaining, the police will strangle him or put their knees on his neck. And because he might then still be struggling, saying, get off me, they can then say it's reasonable force. These are government-sanctioned restraining techniques.
Charlie Veitch, thank you for going underground.
Thank you, Afshin.
Every 4 years, when election campaign time